Skyrim is an amazing game. That is something that cannot be denied. As a matter of fact, Skyrim is so amazing that it made the #1 spot on Game Informer's top 100 RPGs of all time. Why is that so amazing, you might ask? Because Skyrim is not an RPG. To a few of you, the idea of Skyrim not being an RPG may be rather absurd. You're probably already typing in the comments about how stupid I am. But before you do, why don't you pull up a chair and listen up? Because you will likely be in agreement with me by the time I'm finished. To kick this off, I'm going to start with the one characteristic that everybody seems to know when it comes to a role-playing game. And that is, of course, the role. Anytime I hear the Skyrim RPG argument, the #1 thing people will say is a role-playing game is a game where you have a role. And I have to be honest with you, that is the dumbest description of a role-playing game I've ever heard. But I will humor you for a moment. Let's say that is the definition of an RPG. In this scenario, Skyrim would still not be a role-playing game, because Skyrim is specifically designed for you to have no role. You can do and be whatever you want at any moment. You aren't restricted to any class or any role in particular. But even if you did decide to limit yourself to being just a thief or just a mage, Skyrim wouldn't care. Because you can still complete the Thieves Guild and become the guild master without ever being good at thievery. Even if you fail the initiation test, they still want you to join up.
Even though you fouled up the job, I still think you've got the spark I'm looking for.
But in an RPG, that doesn't happen. Your skill matters to the game, and if you want to be in the Thieves Guild, you have to put some effort into being a thief. And that's what's important in an RPG. It's not just about saying you are something, it's about that something having an effect on the game. The next big element of an RPG is the story. Now, if you aren't aware, most games have a story. I know, it's a shock. But what makes an RPG unique is how the story is utilized. In a role-playing game, the story responds to you and your choices to make it feel uniquely your own. A pretty good example of this is the Oblivion Quest Siren's Deception. A group of women have been tricking men into visiting their secluded cabin, and then when one of the men shows up, the women steal that man's valuables. If you're a male when you start the quest, the women will try and trick you as well. However, if you are a female, they will try to convince you to join their gang. No matter what gender you choose, the end result is always the same, but the journey was different. And that is what makes story unique in an RPG. Your choices matter, whether it's the choices made during conversation or your choices made when creating your character. Meaning everyone has an experience that is tailored to them. In Skyrim, however, the story always feels the same. There are moments in Skyrim where this isn't fully true, however, which is important to note, such as deciding between the Imperials or the Stormcloaks. However, these choices are very far and few between. Now, it is important to note that Oblivion doesn't do this very well either. The last big thing I want to talk about is progression, which, to be fair, is something Skyrim has. You level up, you put points into stats, and you get sweet loot. So you're probably thinking, you got me on this one. That old cantina here has tripped up and it turns out Skyrim is an RPG after all. Well, Battlefield also has a progression system, so does that mean Battlefield is an RPG? No, of course not, that's stupid. Progression on its own does not make an RPG. And if you've been following along, then you probably already know where I'm about to go with this. In an RPG, if you're getting more powerful in one skill, then that means you aren't improving in another skill. You can only be so good at something. So do you put all your effort into one particular skill and become a master of that one thing? Or do you spread it around and become just decent at everything? It's all about making choices that affect who you are and who you aren't. Now, when Skyrim launched, it did still hold on to this idea of progression. There were far fewer restrictions than in the past, but your choices did affect you moving forward. However, when Bethesda decided to update Skyrim so that you could continue to level up and eventually unlock everything, it no longer retained that RPG-like progression. So does that mean that when Skyrim launched, it was an RPG? No. A game is an RPG when you take all of these elements and combine them. That is why Battlefield is not an RPG, and why Skyrim is not an RPG. These games borrow elements from RPGs, however, they are not role-playing games themselves. It'd be like having a handle and calling it a sword. You may have one part needed to make a sword, but that doesn't mean you have a sword, and it is the exact same with RPGs. So I've now touched on the core elements that are required to make an RPG, but I wanted to quickly discuss the features that are often associated with RPGs. And I think this is where a lot of confusion stems from, because someone might see a feature such as leveling and think, oh, because it has leveling, it's an RPG. But it's not leveling or dice rolls or turn-based combat that define the genre. At its core, an RPG is all about choices that matter, not just whether you're a thief or a warrior, but how you affect this world. And the world has to respond to that as well. In Skyrim, you can make decisions, you can choose to be a grumpy old blacksmith, but the world doesn't care, because that choice only exists in your head. And in the end, after you've defeated Alduin and saved the world still treats you the same way as when you walked out of Helgen. So what does that mean for Skyrim? Is it in fact a horrible game because it isn't an RPG? Am I trying to ruin Skyrim for everybody? No, that's stupid. Skyrim is still the same fantastic game it's always been, and no random video on the internet can change that. All I wanted to do here was remind people what an RPG actually is, because we're currently in a world where it seems the majority of game developers have forgotten that. And as a massive fan of RPGs, I think that's important. So if you ever hear anyone say that Skyrim is an RPG, just give them a good slap. Actually, you know what? Don't do that, because that's not really legal. Instead, just tell them to check out this video so that way they can be enlightened. Also, while you're at it, why don't you watch this other video on the 5 things Oblivion did better than Skyrim? Because my ultimate goal is to prove that Skyrim is the worst, and everybody should hate it. Goodbye!